Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Gulsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
All right, so kind of, what we wanted to cover today is we've already recorded like an introductory level predation podcast, right?
Right.
And in that podcast, we talked about a couple of studies that did show some positive impacts of predator control on turkey populations. But when we talked about it after the fact, we didn't necessarily feel like we gave you guys quite enough details.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff about those studies that we want to talk about to clarify and give better context on. And that also we wanted to broaden it outside of talking about turkeys specifically to some of the broader literature base, because there's some valuable stuff in that as well. One thing that I kind of wanted to start with is I don't think we have done it enough justification that the fact of the matter is there are a lot of people that are out there that own property or managing turkey populations that are using predator trapping as part of their toolbox. And a lot of those people swear by it.
Yep.
Like that, they have a lot of turkeys and they're attributing that, at least in part and sometimes by and large, to trapping.
Yes.
Of nest predators and other predators of turkeys. And I think we need to give a fair account of that this is a practice that's being used pretty widely. It's definitely widely talked about.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have at least a perception in their situation that it is successful.
Right.
And I think that we need to make sure that we point that out.
Yeah.
That we're not saying that's not true at all. We're wanting to go through the data on it.
Yeah.
And talk about in an experimental framework what expectations should we have
exactly
when we implement trapping. When does it work, and to what degree does it work, and what does it entail to make that happen.
And if I'm being honest, when I have those conversations with landowners and managers, my immediate reaction is to go a little bit on the defensive, and the reason for that is kind of twofold. One is I'm skeptical as a scientist, and I'm supposed to be skeptical as a scientist.
That's our role.
Yeah, until you show me the data.
Yeah.
And just being able to, I never used to see any poults. Now I see poults. Well, maybe that was because you trapped predators. Maybe it was because something else happened that you didn't control for. Maybe you had a timber harvest. Your neighbor had a timber harvest.
Yeah.
Maybe your neighbor started burning, or you started burning, or maybe you just had conducive weather for a couple of years.
Right. Well, we know that populations fluctuate naturally, independent of us. And
sometimes 50% up and down from one year to another with some of these long-term studies.
Right. And sometimes, those things coincide with actions, and we attribute it to that action. But really, without having a proper control and replication, it's hard to say whether or not you're seeing what it looks like.
Yep.
And, that deserves some skepticism and think about that critically. But I think there are enough landowners out there that say that.
Right.
That, they may be seeing a real effect. The other thing to point out is when we are doing things, especially when it's taking a lot of hard work and sweat, we want it to be working.
Yes.
So there may be some of that associated with it. But I think it's important to acknowledge a lot of people are using this on their properties, and they are perceiving a really big effect.
And we're about to have, in an upcoming episode, a conversation with another scientist who falls into that category.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, and I think he'll give a really fair account of what we know and what we don't know in the literature, and talk about some of the experiences that he's had as a land manager with that scientific background.
Absolutely.
So and then he's one of the best there is.
Absolutely. And I would say, the second major reason that I go on the defense by default, if I'm being honest with myself, when this topic comes up with non-scientists, is that we're taught, from very, very early on in our biological education, that predator control is just one aspect of a comprehensive approach to managing game populations. Mm-hmm. And because a lot of landowners tend to address predator issues before they address habitat issues, I think maybe we've swung a little bit too far in the opposite direction, in the sense that we focus a little bit too much on habitat and don't give predator control and that aspect of the management plan enough diligence as we should sometimes, and keep that as a consideration. And I just mentioned that upcoming episode that we have, and that's kind of the same conversation that we're going to have with that scientist mm-hmm. as well, is how he was in that same boat as us, and it wasn't something that he really considered or thought that he should pull out of his toolbox, but he ended up in a situation where he did. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, it's really interesting. Well, let's go ahead and get right into this.
Okay.
I know you were wanting to go back to some of the studies that we have talked about.
The two big ones that I really wanted to discuss, because they're really the closest two studies that we have to an ideal predator removal effect on turkeys type study. But as we'll go into detail and describe in just a minute, they're far less than ideal, but they're the best thing that we've got to go to work with at this point. And so the first one was led by Dan Speake in Alabama in the 70s, and the second one was led by Lovett Williams during the same time period in Florida. And just jumping right into the Speake study, they had 5 study areas. Most of them were in the lower coastal plain of Alabama, but the two big ones that you really need to know about are Choctaw Bluff Management Area, because that's where they implemented predator control as part of this experiment, and the Fred Stimpson Sanctuary, which served as their control area. And one thing that I want to get really clear before we go on, because we talk about predator control and then we talk about controls. What controls are areas where we don't do anything. We don't implement a treatment. We let them stay consistent so that we can compare what happens on the treatment area, in this case, the predator removal site, to see if what we observed actually was a difference due to that treatment that was implemented, versus some of those things that we talked about earlier, which were, annual variation not attributable to predator populations, whether it be weather or some other factor, right?
Right.
So Choctaw Bluff was the treatment area, meaning that's where they removed predators. Fred Stimpson Sanctuary was the control area, meaning they kept things constant throughout the study and did not remove predators. So one thing that I think is worth noting before we jump into this is that based on some survey work that they did prior to the study, turkey populations on both of these areas were what they considered to be categorized as high. So they're pretty strong populations before they did anything. And they monitored a variety of metrics on both of these study areas. So they looked at nest predation rates. They had a sample of 119 nests to look at nest predation. They were using VHF radio telemetry to do that, which was the standard go-to at that point in time. They also looked at poult survival on a small number of poults. They put micro VHF transmitters on 18 to be exact. And then they used road surveys like many states use now to get indexes of the poult per hen ratios as part of that study. And so that brings us to the actual treatment, which in this case was predator control. So the treatment or the predator control activities were implemented from 1971 to 1975 on Choctaw Bluff. And to control the predators there, they used strychnine injected chicken eggs, live cage traps, foothold traps, and shooting.
Yeah. That's interesting.
So we'll get into a little bit more detail on that in just a second. But
do you think that they were they just riding around? Well, I'm envisioning a whole bunch of folks sitting in the back of a truck riding around shooting raccoons at night.
I don't know that was that far from the truth, but they did note that only about 10% of the total removal and total number of animals removed was from shooting.
Yeah.
So we'll go ahead and write that off as probably not a major contributing factor to what
fed the graduate students.
Yeah.
Let them go out and kill
they
them.
needed some supplemental protein, right?
Yeah.
All right. So the big two.
Hey, don't knock it until you've tried it, raccoon. Now.
The big two that were responsible for the reduction in predator numbers were the poison eggs, of course, and then the traps.
Yeah.
And we have some numbers to break that down in just a second.
Yeah. So the strychnine, how many, what was the percentage of predators? Didn't you say they?
It was, well, you want to go ahead and just jump right into that?
Yeah.
So I'll just go from the years, starting with 71 and going through 75. This is the percentage of the total predators removed that they believed were poisoned versus trapped. I mean, obviously they knew which animals they trapped, right?
Yeah, that's
part of the problem
obvious
with determining how many they killed by poison is that some of those animals crawled up in a hole and died.
Well, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
Is how do they know how many died from poisoning if you put a couple eggs out there, which you were going to talk about the intensity at which they did that here in a minute. But you put a poison egg out there and something eats it, it doesn't just fall dead right there every time, right?
No, it doesn't. And what's interesting is the authors of these two papers had very different views on quantifying, predator mortality due to poison. So Speake gave exact numbers, and I'm going to share those in just a second. But Williams said that they couldn't count the predators killed by poison accurately, but they said, quote, "We found many dead skunks, raccoons, and opossums. It is safe to say they had eaten the poisoned eggs." So they didn't take it further than that.
We don't know, but we found some dead ones, and they probably ate poison eggs.
But Speake's lab was better at counting poison mortality.
Or they were presuming more.
Exactly. And so starting in 1971, so this is the proportion or the percentage of the total removal attributable to poison versus trapping. So 1971, it was 73% poisoned. 72, 84% poisoned. And then it goes down from there. 73 was 51%, 74 was 42% poisoned, and 75 was 34% poisoned.
Well, that's really interesting. It seems like there's a pattern where maybe the first year they weren't very good at finding all the dead stuff. Then the second year they found a lot of it, and then maybe they just ran out of stuff that like to eat eggs.
Yeah, maybe they did.
Who knows why?
But
that pattern. They also may have divested their attention to that, or who knows what is happening. Maybe they were just less predators. I don't know.
But the salient point I think here is that poison was responsible for removal of anywhere from 34 to 84% of the predators they removed in any given year. Yeah,
that's definitely interesting and important because we can't use that method.
Absolutely. So another important point to make to kind of lay this out in the right context is the area that they were implementing this predator control on. So the smallest area that they treated with predator control in any year of the study was 4,700 acres, so almost 5,000 acres. And during 2 years, they noted the treatment area was doubled in size in an attempt to increase the effect. And so this is something.
Like, hey, we're just gonna double the amount of area this year, and trying to magnify this effect.
Right, and these are two great, renowned wild turkey researchers from the Southeast.
Yeah,
and they were dealing with the same issues that we deal with today, that every researcher deals with.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily matter if it's public or private land, but you're always dealing with competing objectives on the land base.
Well, I think it's important, to put that into context. Like both of these folks, I mean, they were ahead of their time.
Mm-hmm.
They're renowned for their contributions to turkey research, but there were some problems with experimental design. Like you're saying, that we're all dealing with as scientists. We have to respect the wishes of landowners and conform to different problems that arise that don't necessarily allow you to have the most robust experimental design.
Yeah, so it introduces a little bit of noise in the data set and some uncertainty.
Weakens our inference in many cases.
So we've established how they were killing them, the area that they were killing them on. What's also important is the time of year and the duration. So they were doing this every year from February to at least May, and some of the years they continued all the way till June. Mm-hmm. And so the significance of that to a manager is that they're starting to control predators leading up to the nesting season and then continuing through it. Mm-hmm. So that is one way that if you were to try to implement an effective predator control management strategy, that you could overcome some of those issues related to compensatory reproduction and compensatory immigration that we talked about in that previous episode that was kind of the introduction to predator-prey dynamics.
Yeah, and what some of the issues that might arise that might dampen the effect of trapping, or the timing and intensity is trying to address that.
Exactly. So you're starting at a time of the year where it gives you a little bit of lead up to start driving those populations down, and then you hopefully get them down to some low level before turkey nesting starts, and you maintain them there until most of the nesting effort has subsided at that point. So as far as the intensity at which they implemented removal activities, they had poison eggs spaced out about every 300 to 400 yards in a grid across the property, which when we're talking about 5,000 up to 11,000 acres during 2 years, I mean, that's some serious effort.
Yeah, and I think this is something that we should definitely put some perspective on, because I think people don't necessarily understand what intensive means.
We talk about intensive trapping all the time, but we don't necessarily put a number on it.
Nobody defines what is intensive, and if you want to try to approximate what they did, well, of course we can't use the poison. So, but if you were going to do that with trapping, let's just look at the average area that they were doing. That's what, about, let's say 7,000 acres or so. Mm-hmm. And, so at that spatial scale, they're looking at trap nights. Now, this include the poison and the trapping, but we'll just kind of include those both as trapping effort. When they say trap nights, they mean like, okay, if you had 1,200 trap nights and you had 12 traps, that means you have 12 traps running for 100 nights.
Exactly.
So that'll put things into perspective. But on average, across these years, they are probably in the 6,000 to 7,000, maybe a little bit lower because of that 1 year. But let's just say 6,000 or 7,000 acres, or 6,000 or 7,000 acres on average, and about 6,000 to 7,000 trap nights on average. Mm-hmm. So essentially, what they're hitting here is about a trap night per acre.
Yeah. And
think about that. That's important for you to kind of come up with a scale of what intensive means.
So like on a 100-acre property, you would want to shoot for 100 trap nights to meet this level of intensity.
Which seems like it's really doable. If I've got 10 traps, I just have to trap for 10 nights. Mm-hmm. But some issues arise with that, because you also need to be doing that across that time scale, right?
Yeah.
That's important. So that intensity may be approaching what they did here, but it also needs to be lengthened out over a longer time.
Yes.
The other thing is we probably lean a little harder into trapping because they were much more effective with poison here.
Yeah.
So we probably would want to shade that up to remove the same number of predators.
If we wanted to get the effect size that they did.
Yeah. Right. If you're trying to mimic what they're doing here as their intensive, put that in quotes, their intensive practice, but as you might imagine, you have I think you said it, I know we've talked about it, the scale that you can operate, the larger the property size you have, the more likely you are to have an impact on the predator populations, but it also increases the amount of effort that you need to implement to have an effect.
Yeah, and just to kind of recap all of this, so number one, they were using, just as far as how did the results that we're about to go into translate into your potential property, right? Mm-hmm. Well, number one, you have to keep in mind that they poisoned. Number two, you have to keep in mind that they were trapping 7,000 acres a year. So their ability to influence predator populations is much greater than on even 600-700 acres, right? I mean, that's a big property, 600 to 700 acres for most landowners.
Yeah.
But still, it's going to pale in comparison to this. And then number three, they're trapping for 4 or 5 months a year, 4 months a year.
Yeah.
So definitely temper your expectations based off of that. So real quick, they had some adult males and females transmitted as part of this study too. And just out of interest, I figured I'd speak to that real briefly. They had no gobblers were killed. It was only jakes that were killed by predators.
Not hunters.
Excluding hunters. Yeah.
So no hunters killed jakes.
I can't guarantee that. So as far as the jakes killed, 3 were killed by bobcat, 1 golden eagle, and 1 gray fox. And most of the hen predation was during nesting, as we would expect. We talked about that on an earlier episode. Hens are most vulnerable to predators when they're incubating. The breakdown there was 6 hens were killed by bobcats, 3 by fox, 2 by dog, and 1 by golden eagle. And so we're seeing this recurring theme with bobcats being the top adult predator, which was kind of surprising to me. I generally have thought in the past about owls, great horned owls in particular, being the primary predator of adults. But bobcats showing up here a couple times. And
with a nesting hen, I guess that makes sense. That the bobcats might be a problem. The thing, I guess, that was more surprising that we've talked about to me was the dogs showing up.
Yeah, I was surprised by that. And there were a few studies from this era throughout the Southeast that repeatedly mention problems with feral dogs.
Yeah, I know a couple of speak studies.
Yeah. And Ray Metzler was involved in one of those as part of his master's work at Auburn. And when I had read that on occasions in the past, up until last week when I was on a conference call with you, I'd been kind of dismissive of it. I was thinking, this is rural South. We're in Alabama. During the 1970s, there's probably stray dogs everywhere. People didn't care for their dogs the way that they do nowadays. And I was thinking, that's probably not as much of modern turkey management relevance.
Yeah.
But we had that conference call last week where we're meeting with some of your colleagues at the University of Florida, and they've been amassing all this trail camera data from all these different research projects across the Southeast for about the past couple years, I think.
Yeah, several years, and over 100 sites.
Yeah, over 100 sites. And apparently they had almost as many detections of free-ranging dogs. They didn't call them feral. They called them free-ranging dogs as they did coyotes.
Yeah.
And that blew my mind. We don't know if these are somebody's well-cared-for farm dog that wanders back into the National Forest or WMA and walks by a camera, or if they're truly a feral dog that's out there hunting on the landscape, but they're there. They're still there.
If I had told you that we would have distributed cameras all across the South, and you would detect, or you could just pick a random one and you're just as likely to detect a dog as a coyote. Would you have thought that was true?
No, I wouldn't have expected that at all. I would have expected it to be way skewed towards coyotes.
Yeah. And I don't even hear about dogs really that much, but you certainly hear about coyotes plenty.
Absolutely.
And it was it's really striking. So maybe they're more of a problem than we realize. They certainly have affected turkeys in some of the speaks work. So.
Sure. All right. So their overall nest predation rate, and so this is independent of the treatment or the control. This is just their overall nest predation rate was 44%, 44.5% to be specific, which is really low compared to a lot of modern studies.
Yeah.
And they caveat that, and this is something that I don't think we've talked about on this podcast before, but I know you and I have had conversations about. But they wrote, almost all nests were discovered after incubation had begun. So this is not a complete picture of the impact of predators on turkey nests. Many were probably destroyed during the egg laying process.
Well, I think that's an important point of emphasis, because we look at these historical numbers and like, wow, nesting success was way higher than it is now.
Yeah, we're seeing like 20 to 25% nest success now.
But the reality is they did not have the technology to detect them as early as we do now.
Mm-hmm.
So we're probably capturing a lot more of the mortality that they would have missed.
Yeah.
Because the nest would be gone and the turkey may have moved on and nested somewhere else before they detected.
Right.
So,
and even with our GPS transmitters now, which are much more precise,
right,
we still probably miss some predation events that happen, 1, 2, 3 days into laying.
Yeah, I think that's important. The gap between what it was then and now is it has to be narrower than, because they would have missed some events, so they have to be underestimating the role of predation in that. So I think that's important, that technology has changed such that we're picking up some more of those, and that's accounting for some of the decrease in nest success that we're seeing in the literature comparatively.
Right. Absolutely. So you wanted to make a guess what the primary nest predator was, even though we just admitted to everybody this is the second time we recorded this podcast, so you should know the answer.
Well, you were I think that you were probably well, I don't know what the word I'm looking for. My memory is not
overestimating your recall ability.
Yeah. See, I couldn't even remember that term. So you're definitely giving me a little too much credit for my memory.
Okay. We'll just throw an animal out there then.
For which one?
Number one nest predator.
I'm pretty sure I said it the first time. I'm going to say it again, and I do not remember if it was correct. Raccoons.
Exactly. Raccoon. Guess what number 2 was?
I really don't remember.
I would go with possum.
Yeah. Let's see. I think I said crows because
Oh, you did say crows.
Yeah.
It was dogs.
Dogs were number 2.
Dogs were the number 2 nest predator.
And again, we've just learned that they were detected in this regional study with a bunch of data.
Yeah.
Bunch of sites with cameras. They were detected almost as much or about the same as coyotes.
That's right.
In fact, they were not statistically different from coyotes, as far as I remember.
That's right. That's what I remember too.
That definitely raises some eyebrows.
It gives me pause. It gives me pause for sure. Okay, so overall pork. I can't even speak now.
Portal. I think you're looking for portal.
I think I was going to say pork. It is getting on towards dinner time now.
Yeah.
Overall poult mortality was 75%, which is actually higher than what we see in most studies. Recently it's usually around 2/3, 66%.
Yeah.
Die, 33% live.
But again, what was it? How many poults were there?
The samples, 18 poults.
Yeah, so like even 1 or 2 different in the observed survival would change it to the same as.
Exactly.
So the reason we keep bringing stuff like that up is to put things in perspective. Like there's some limitations with the interpretation of the data because, one poult randomly dying could change it from being
absolutely
higher than it is now to being the same.
Exactly. It's an important point. So now getting to the good stuff, what everybody really wants to hear. They surveyed hens with poults. So that just means the number of hens that they see that have at least 1 poult. Mm-hmm. And they surveyed poult per hen ratios, which means if they have poults, how many do they have? On a 14-mile survey route on each of these 2 study areas. So the predator removal area compared to the control area where they did nothing. And they found that that 55% of the hens on the predator removal site had poults, at least 1 poult, versus only 24% of the hens where they did nothing, the control, had poults. But what was really interesting to me is that the poult per hen ratios, not just the hen with poults, the poult per hen ratios were the same between the removal and the control area. So that indicated that the benefit of trapping was on increasing nest success. Mm-hmm. But once the poults got past that hatching process, once they fledged, it didn't benefit brood survival, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. Well, it definitely is starting to suggest some compensatory issues.
And if you guys want we provided a lot of information on that in that introductory predator-prey dynamics podcast, talking about how, just because you get an animal past one life stage doesn't mean that it's not going to die from something else at the next.
Well, and I think, just to rehash a little bit, why might that be? We've had a couple of examples. Some of it, one of the ones that, if we draw from some of my research experience during my PhD, we had fawns in that study from, the deer that we captured the fawns and followed them around to see their fate. We had a bunch of fawns that were bleeding because they were hungry. Yeah. And they ultimately starved to death. But
can you do that bleed again?
Nah. Nah. Yeah.
I think it's more of a meh.
That's etched into my brain because, we were checking up on these fawns and we can't do anything about it. It's kind of sad, but it really galvanized this into my brain, like this idea that ultimate versus proximate causes of mortality are very different things, and they can have dramatically different implications for your management. And in that case, a fawn that's sitting around doing that is much easier to detect from a predator.
Right.
And of course, the predator's going to come eat it.
Right.
It's also probably less well equipped to escape it.
Yep.
And, that's something really important to put in perspective because we might assign predation as the proximate cause of death, but the ultimate cause of death was an issue with nutrition.
Exactly.
Where the female wasn't able to nourish that fawn, and that got it killed by a predator when it was going to die of starvation anyway.
And it's easy to imagine a situation or a scenario where it would play out similarly for a poult, right?
Yeah.
So maybe, you remove the predator, so the poult that otherwise would not have hatched ends up hatching, but a good brooding habitat is lacking on the landscape. It's possible that, that poult won't have enough protein-rich insects in its diet, and then it dies,
it's not growing as fast to get out of the risk stage. It's not getting to flight as fast.
So maybe it just dies straight up from starvation. That's still, compensatory mortality.
Right.
Maybe it just slows the poult down enough that it gets hit by a fox instead.
Yeah.
But ultimately that poult would have died anyway. The fox just ate it while it's still fresh.
Yeah, they're just compensatory reasons to die.
Right.
And everything wants to kill one. And, just to give an example with adults, diseases like LPDB we're really worried about. Mm-hmm. Well, which hen is going to be the one that gets killed?
The one with LPDB.
Yeah. I mean, she's slower. There are even cases when a sick hen, people can walk up and grab the thing. Yeah. Like, of course, that's the one that's going to get eaten.
Absolutely.
And that's not to diminish the role of predators, but it is obscuring our understanding of that ultimate cause that we can address.
Absolutely.
And explaining potentially why sometimes we see patterns like this, where we don't, we get rid of or do a really good job, probably better than what we can now because of the tool that was used that we don't have anymore. And it didn't equate directly to more turkeys.
Right.
So I think it's good to make sure that we go through that and understand that it's a little more complex than just getting rid of predators.
So one of the other things that I thought was really interesting that they found was that if you looked at the poult per hen ratios for all years in the study, there were actually some years where poult per hen ratios on the control, the no removal sites, were higher than poult per hen ratios on the predator removal site. Mm-hmm. Now, let me explain this very clearly. So within any given year, so we just compare 71 removal to 71 control, removal was always higher for poult per hen. But if you compared like specifically, I don't remember what the exact years were, but it was like 73 on the control site, that poult per hen ratio was higher than 72 on the removal site, which I thought was kind of a red flag to me because, obviously they were seeing some treatment effect, but there's a lot of noise in that data set. There was a lot of annual variation going on there.
Yeah, I know that. I think
makes
we know
me less
that,
confident
that populations are inherently cycling.
Yes.
At the population level, there are a lot of things going on, and we have boom hatch years and bust hatch years, and it's showing you that really is what is driving that cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing that I meant to ask you, but we kind of went on down through this a little faster. Did they know what the poult per hen ratios looked like between the areas beforehand?
I don't think they did. That was a good question, but I don't remember anything in the article saying that they explored that or documented it beforehand.
So they knew that some of the sites had a relatively high turkey population, probably from those transects they were driving or whatever.
And they even said directly to that point, it is important to remember that turkey populations were always high on the predator removal area even before trapping.
Yeah. So, but were they higher on the predator removal trapping before this study started? Were they higher on the predator removal area than the control areas
that were
paired? Because it seems like that's pretty important.
Yep.
And we talked about this with other studies. We often do these studies in places where we know that the animal of interest isn't doing very well.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like that happened in this case, and that's kind of another red flag. If you have a population that's already doing better, and you compare that to a population that's not doing so good.
Well, no, their main comparison with the poult per hen ratios was between Choctaw Bluff and Stimson Sanctuary. So those were both populations that were classified as strong.
Okay, well,
ahead of time.
Yeah, so that's a better comparison,
right? But you bring up an important point. It would have been interesting if they had pre-study poult per hen ratios on both sites to see if inherently, due to some characteristics of Choctaw Bluff, poult per hen ratios were higher there,
right,
than on Stimson Sanctuary.
So that would have made it much stronger.
Exactly.
And again, they were working within limitations that they had at the time, and they also didn't have the funding available and that sort of stuff that we do now.
Right.
So important to think about, though, to make sure we're putting all this in the right context.
Absolutely. And so here's just a couple more highlights, and we'll jump on to Williams down in Florida. I thought it was funny. They didn't factor in trapping costs. They mentioned this in the discussion. They didn't factor in trapping costs because trappers were free during that time.
Yeah.
They said, you just provide trappers access and they'll come do it for you. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. And that was based on the fur market would pay the trappers.
Sure. And the people that were interested and inclined and had the skill sets to do it at that point in time compared to now. Much more numerous.
I wonder about the interaction of the trappers with the poisoning and
how they felt about that.
Well, yes, it's making it harder to do the trapping job, but also were they grabbing, dead raccoon if they found it and skinning that thing out?
I mean, I'm sure they told them, it was like, if you find a poisoned coon, just feel free to take the pelt. Yeah. Just let us know.
Don't eat it.
Give us a count.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about.
The last thing I wanted to talk about is something that doesn't get often brought up. But they said that dispersal between fall and spring would probably limit the results observed on even relatively large properties. And so we're about to get in an upcoming episode into some data for other game bird species. Mm-hmm. And, turkeys occupy this unique role that they're one of the few game birds that we hunt during the breeding season in spring, right? Mm-hmm. And for a lot of these other species, like waterfowl, various species of partridge and grouse and stuff like that, we hunt them during the fall and the winter time. And in some cases, predator removal has been shown effective for increasing fall populations of those animals. Bobwhite's another example.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that we're going to go into in a little later in this episode is just looking at the broader literature base and some of those patterns that you're bringing up hold true there as well.
But with turkeys, we're trying to carry them obviously into the spring. For the majority of hunters, there's still some fall hunters, but for the majority of turkey hunters, they want to hunt them in spring. And so that adds another layer of complexity into this whole predator-prey dynamic when it comes to turkeys, is that we have to, if we're going to implement predator removal, it needs to be done during the nesting in spring, and we've got to carry those turkeys for almost an entire calendar year before they enter that huntable population. And if you're talking about gobblers, you're only hunting, 2-year-old or older birds. You've got to carry them over another year for that to translate into a greater huntable population.
Even like for me, I've never even challenged the idea that increasing poult production on my property is going to lead to more turkeys on my property. Like, it just doesn't intuitively come to mind for me. Like you were talking about the example with bucks when you're talking to landowners. A landowner, or it's much more widely accepted that the smaller the landholding that you have, the harder it is to raise a mature buck and not be influenced by your neighbors.
Right. Yeah. I remember we had that conversation earlier today, and I was saying that I feel like sometimes we inconsistently apply logic to two different scenarios. Scenario one, I think most hunters would readily admit that if I have a small property, my chance of protecting a buck to an older age class is diminished, right? Or protecting a jake until he becomes a gobbler,
Right.
But then when it turns to predator control, we very happily sometimes go out and trap 25 to 50 acres and think nothing of it.
Right. And never challenge that the turkeys that you're making, they're just going to stay there.
Yeah.
Well, that's probably not the case.
Yeah.
Since a lot of them disperse.
That's absolutely right.
Another thing that, just to add in, it's really common that, I know you talk to plenty of people about this and hear the same thing because we've talked about it, but I always hear landowners complain that their neighbors are the problem. So I like to...
It's never them.
Yeah. Everybody's neighbor is always the problem. So here a couple of times that we've gotten into the more intense discussion at meetings or something that I'm speaking at or whatever. And I've brought up, it's like, it's funny that everybody's neighbor is always the problem. So if everybody's neighbor is the problem, you're the problem too.
Yeah, right.
Which I think is funny to kind of turn on them. But, it normally lightens that mood a little bit. But everybody talks about that with deer.
Yeah.
But you don't hear that as much, or don't think about it intuitively as much, or at least I don't think about, the turkeys that you're making on your property. Large portion of them are probably leaving to disperse.
Yeah.
And I know I've asked you this before, but what is that male bias like it is with deer, or do you know? I can't remember.
You've asked me that question 3 times today, and I still haven't Googled it.
Well, one of the points of the podcast, we're going to be bringing in experts on different topic areas with wild turkey science, and I know that there are some other folks that have kind of gotten at this kind of thing. But I can't remember if there's a sex bias, but that'll be a good topic for us to.
That is a good question to keep in mind. Another one that would be a good one to keep in mind.
What's that?
Genetic sex determination in turkeys.
I remember one time you got asked about that.
I did.
Isn't it the reverse of humans?
No, it's not even the same in any way. It's like, maybe it is. See, I've already forgotten that too, but I know instead of X's,
Google it.
I know instead of X's and Y's, it's Z's and W's.
Yeah, what is it? I don't even know.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean,
we'll get somebody to talk about genetics.
There was some avian biologist out there that just had to change the names of it to be different.
What are you doing?
It happens this time of day.
Yeah. So the other thing is, I don't know how far they go. What's the average dispersal distance for a turkey, and what proportion of them are dispersed?
I better start writing these down.
Yeah, we need to get some folks.
But I think the key takeaway here is that a lot of those turkeys you're making, you're gonna lose to other people. And that's not a problem. I mean, we need to be
Well,
managing.
if everybody's making turkeys,
then you're getting somebody else's.
Yeah.
But we know that it's not that way. And I say that not to, disincentivize or talk someone out of doing things that benefit turkey production, but it's just one more of those things that makes you need to justifies tempering your expectations, right?
Yeah. Which, again, there are plenty of people that are trapping and have viewed that as a real success and hear more gobbling and have, they have more enjoyment from their property.
Exactly.
So maybe it's less of a immigration out of the population issue than we think. That'll be a really good topic to bring some folks in. But another thing is there probably just isn't that much data on turkeys because it's inherently difficult to measure. I mean, we've talked about the challenges of radio tagging a little tiny poult, but imagine trying to tag that poult and then have it be something they could carry all the way through the fall that you can then go find where that turkey went. I mean, it's, the technology is probably just now getting
we can see how adults shift between fall and spring, fall, winter, and spring ranges, but it's harder with poults for sure. Yeah,
and I mean, maybe if we capture poults in the fall before they've dispersed, we could get some kind of tag on them and follow them. But it's just been really difficult for a long.
Especially because we still have so many questions about the reproductive season. Right, that's where
a lot of our focus
so much
has
of our
been
focus
there.
is.
Yeah, but it is curious to know that information. It could be really important,
right,
for the management of the species. So,
all right, you ready to go back down to Florida?
You mean
literally and figuratively? Yes, I know you're ready to get back home, but figuratively, we're going to venture there with the next study. So Lovett Williams again did his work on Likes Fish Eating Creek WMA in Glades County, Florida. We established earlier today that despite being a professor at University of Florida, you don't know where that is.
I have a vague idea.
Whereabouts?
It's in Florida.
Panhandle Peninsula?
I'm not sure. I'm not going to say it on the air.
I don't blame you.
There's so many
few
counties.
Alabama
there's
counties.
like 100 counties.
There's a few Alabama counties you could get me on too. So I should.
Well, and I hadn't been down there that long, but and you grew up in Alabama, so that's not fair.
I mean, 9 years.
Well,
they don't teach geography till 12th grade here.
It was 13th grade for me. Yeah.
All right. So they had 140 hens tagged. They tracked the fate of 108 nests. And similar to Speak, they injected eggs with strychnine. And instead of comparing two different study areas, they had a treatment zone and a control zone. So they put the eggs out on about half the study area, and the other half was a control, no treatment zone.
Was it just one study area?
Yes, it was one study area, that Fish Eating Creek WMA.
So there's no replication?
There's no replication. So...
Yes, temporal replication.
Exactly. And again, in contrast to Speak, they didn't really do much foothold trapping, cage trapping, or shooting. It was pretty much just the poison eggs in this case. And like I said, they already felt like they couldn't count the number of predators killed accurately, but they found a lot of dead ones all over the place. One other thing that was interesting to me is that they didn't find, at least, I'm not saying it didn't happen, but they didn't find any foxes. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, they did. They said they thought they killed 2 gray foxes, 1 bobcat, and 1 crow that they knew of. Relatively small in number, I would guess, to like primary nest predators like raccoons and possums and skunks. But they found no instances of poisoned hawks, owls, armadillos, or pigs. And probably that last one is most interesting to people, is that they weren't finding dead pigs. And I don't know if their dose was even high enough to kill a pig. I think strychnine is, I don't know much about poison, but it's pretty potent stuff. My guess is that it would kill a pig if it ate it.
Yeah.
But that kind of coincides or adds some credibility to what some of the other folks have been talking about lately, especially Mike Chamberlain and Brett Collier, saying that they think that the incidental take of turkey nests by pigs is relatively low. and that it's not a targeted behavior that they learn.
Yeah. Well, you also think about, differences, which we've already gone through, but where turkeys are nesting is not necessarily where pigs are frequenting.
Sure.
And a lot of the areas that we've studied, the hen nesting doesn't necessarily overlap with pigs.
Right.
So they're obviously not a big problem then. But an interesting thought that just came to mind, I was kind of looking through these different animals. You brought up the dose issue, but I also was thinking, what would you expect if animals weren't dying immediately? What would you expect to not be able to find very reliably? I would expect it to be avian species that are highly mobile.
Yeah.
Or something that could go down a hole.
Yeah.
Or a really big mammal that it either didn't kill or that it got, went a long ways before it died.
Yeah.
And those were the ones that they noted. The hawks, owls, armadillos, and pigs.
Yeah.
It's just something else to think about. You can't just take these things at face value, and that's what we're really trying to be skeptical of.
Yeah.
And make sure that we're thinking through all of the different things. So, they noted that they did not find any of those things, but that may be because those things weren't important predators, or they may have been harder to find.
Right.
Dead. So, interesting
line
of thought.
So here's one of the things that I think Williams' study had going for it that Speak's did not is, whereas Speak was just looking at these road surveys to determine the treatment effect, Williams was actually looking at changes in nest success using tracked hens, right? So probably a little bit more accurate representation of what was going on as far as the nest success aspect of it.
Well, in terms of the approach.
Yes, exactly. In terms of the approach. We'll talk about some other issues with that in just a second. But here's the number everybody wants to hear. Poisoned area, 72% nest success. Control area, 59% nest success.
I mean, even with 59, I'm jumping for joy.
I would be absolutely happy with 40% nest success compared to the 20 to 25% rates that we've been seeing commonly lately.
Right. I think that's an important thing to point out. And then looking at the 59 to 72 with the treatment, that makes it look really good.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking
Absolutely.
win for, in this case, poisoning, but win for predator removal.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. But then you keep reading and things get a little squirrely.
Yeah, which is, again, we're not trying to diminish how effective predator trapping is or isn't. We are trying to show some of the issues with the data that we
things you have to consider. And especially because without a doubt, these are the two studies that get shared more often on social media than any others in support of predator trapping.
Well, and there are two things about this that I never, outside of talking with you about it and ghost recording it 4 or 5 times until we finally turned the microphone on. I've never heard anybody put into context, which is pretty striking once you do.
Right. Okay, so here it is. You ready?
Yes.
During just the years, so those numbers I just reported to you, 59 in control, 72
in
success in treatment. Those were across the total 8 years of the study. Okay. Mm-hmm. But in 3 years of that study, they weren't doing any predator control.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they had nothing but control area.
They had nothing but control. And if you look at just the years where they were poisoning, nest success was 72% on the poison area versus 71 on the control.
Can you say that again?
If you narrow it down to just the 5 out of 8 years of the study where they were killing predators with poison, 72% nest success on poison area, 71% success on control area. Exactly the same.
Yeah. Well, they're 1% different.
I mean, in my book, that's exactly the same.
Well, I'm being facetious. I mean, they're obviously not different from one another.
And so this gives me, aside from the sample size issue we're about to talk about, this gives me significant pause about the validity of their comparisons between the treatment and control area, because they even said themselves that poisoning probably affected the control area as well.
Yeah.
And so that diminishes your ability to say whether it was actually, what the actual effect size was.
The other problem, as we've already talked about, is the population parameters vary widely from year to year on the same sites.
Yes.
We know that really well from a bunch of really large sample size, long-term studies that have been done in a lot of areas.
Right.
That the nesting success, for instance, can be substantially different on the same area from year to year, and you're not changing anything.
Right.
You're just letting it go.
Yeah.
And tracking it. So
yeah, it can double or halve from 1 year
so
to
that's a problem that
another.
Part of their control numbers for that average that kind of pulled it down were from years that they didn't have a comparison for poisoning.
Yeah.
It just happened to be
Exactly.
lower in that year, and we don't know why.
Exactly.
So that's a red flag.
Right.
So another problem, and I think we're ready to get into it, is the sample size. And you've astutely put this table in here in a way that I can barely see, but I am capable of reading fast enough to interpret.
Are reading glasses on the horizon for you?
Oh yeah, my eyesight, man, it's getting bad.
So just
in general,
total sample size.
When I'm looking at year to year, it's a long-term study, but there is no year where they have double digits in nests that were tracked across the entire study.
No.
Not just in one treatment versus the other. They don't even have 10 nests in a single year that they tracked between control and treatment.
Yeah. So just on the treatment area, starting in 1969 and going through 73, 3 nest, 7 nest, what was that one? 6 nest, 5 nest, 8 nests.
Yeah.
That's total on the treatment area. Going over to the control, 1969, 5 nest. Next year, 9, 6, 5, 3. And so we're talking about...
I may have said that a little bit wrong. That they didn't. Neither the treatment nor the control had double digits nests tracked in any year.
Yeah. The overall sample size throughout the study on the treatment area was 29 across 5 years. And it was 28 across 5 years on the control.
Yeah.
That's a hard sample size to make any meaningful conclusions off of.
Well, think about that. Okay, we've got 4 nests and one of them gets predated. That's 25%. Okay. Is that really different than 50% if 2?
It doubles. If you take one more nest, that rate, that's calculated rate doubles.
Yeah, so that I've never heard anybody put that into context.
Right.
And that sample size, given, again, they had lots of limitations. I don't even know how they got... I don't even know how they pulled it off, to be honest with you, the study that they did, because of, all the issues surrounding it. But it's really hard to hang your hat on 4 or 5 nests.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's just there's too much variation and randomness that's not you can't incorporate with a sample size like that.
And they even said, this is a quote from the article, it's unclear whether the use of poisoned eggs was responsible for the 13% higher nesting success during the 4 years they were distributed.
Yeah.
They knew they knew the limitations of their data.
Right. And I think the problem is that people just grab that number, and have been one of those people that have just kind of looked at that at face value and realized, oh, wow, the difference between 72 and 59 is it's not nearly as striking when you think, oh, that might have been 1 nest in 1 year.
Yeah, absolutely.
That drove that difference.
Yes, 13% difference is all.
Yeah, and what if there's only 30 nests total, that's literally 1.
Right.
That could drive the pattern. Just switch 1 from one column to the other column. So, I think we're just trying to put into context what we have to work with, and it's
with two studies that are highly, widely publicized in the turkey hunting and management community.
I hear it all the time. People talk about doing what they're doing everything for turkeys they can. And the first thing, almost without hesitation and across the board, the first thing that I hear people say when they say they're trying to help turkeys, they say trapping, which it's remarkable to me that we put that much emphasis on it and we don't have any more data on it.
Mm-hmm.
It's obviously a really important tool that a lot of people think is potentially the most valuable tool.
Yeah.
And we don't have better data on it. And that's just, it's incredible to me.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the reasons for that is, as we talked about earlier, it would probably need to be a multi-state study. I don't see a single state being able to afford the kind of replication and the scale and how much. I mean, my God, could you imagine how much you'd have to pay for the trapping, contracting trappers to do that, if you can even find enough trappers that are willing to commit to trap on a single study area from February to May or June.
Right. Well, I mean, and that, where are you going to do it?
Right.
Like, we're talking about all the inherent problems with doing a study like this. Well, a lot of our studies end up on public tracts of land, which we're going to get into down the road. There's, the majority of the South is private land, and there are a lot different things going on public and the private land. So there, that's one thing. But where are you going to find enough land that you can actually have a robust design? And, when we get onto private land, we have issues with the size of the properties and competing objectives with landowner wishes and all sorts of issues that come up with trying to accomplish this. And we really need to do it at a large scale and a lot of context to understand how effective is predator trapping in a wide variety of contexts, so we know what to tell people.
Yeah, the other problem that we run into a lot of times where you want to implement a treatment and see an animal response, but to quantify that animal's response requires fitting it with a GPS tag. The problem with that is a lot of times we capture those animals during a time of the year that is prior to the period that we're really interested in. So in this case, we'd be trapping during winter. And then trapping turkeys. That is, we'd be catching turkeys during wintertime.
The radio tags go on in the winter.
Yeah, and then shortly thereafter, we would initiate predator trapping. And then, of course, you've got nesting in early spring. There's no guarantee that all that time and effort that you put into putting that transmitter on that bird, there's no guarantee that bird's still going to be there. Yeah. It could die. It could leave the site. It could go over to the control side instead of the treatment side.
Well, I know there's also there's problems with this when we trap animals. I hear it from different researchers, and there's a consistent problem. We trap a bird on a WMA, and then it ends up on private land. Then we don't have access anymore.
Exactly.
So we don't even know what they're doing. And just the smaller the initial study area, the more difficult.
Right.
The other problem that you're bringing up is, where do you do the trapping, the control, the predator control?
Right.
Because you trap a bunch of hens in one place, and then you're going to do your predator control in that place. But what if they all end up nesting somewhere else? So there's just layers of problems trying to do this.
Yeah, I mean, that's it's so tough when it involves animal capture to monitor the treatment response. Because I mean, a perfect example of this is during my master's research, we were trying to test a couple novel fencing designs for keeping deer out of roadways. And so we wanted pre-treatment data, and then we'd implement the treatments, and then we wanted to see post-treatment to see how roadway crossings changed. And you can imagine that most of the deer, I mean, I was confining my capture efforts to that area just right around this roadway we were going to set up the test fences. But, half of those deer just went off in all these various directions. And we could never get any response, document treatment responses because they weren't there. Luckily enough stayed by that we could get some data, but this happens all the time when you're trying to track animals in response to treatments. Yeah. It's tough.
Well, and so I think it's important for us to be transparent about those issues, because I know that there are probably a lot of people frustrated. Like, why do we not have better data? I'm one of those people.
And then
but also, this is a real challenge to meet that is just really difficult to accomplish to begin with.
Yeah. And the I can't even talk, man.
You want me to get you a hamburger?
Put a gobble in there. The alternative to using, GPS telemetry to monitor those treatment response is to use something that's more removed or remote sensed, like trail cameras, right? Or like road surveys, like they used in the Speak study, for example. But the problem is you run into issues with detecting the animals, given that they're actually there, or if they're not there, maybe they're there and you just didn't observe. There's issues with that, and the data is not as clean. It's not as much of a direct measure of an actual treatment response as it is to look at something as concrete as whether that nest hatched or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I think
you want to zoom back out now?
Yeah, I think we've adequately, covered some of the reservation that we should, skepticism that would be healthy to exercise with the turkey specific research. Mm-hmm. But I also think there's a lot of value in kind of zooming out. And let's just look at predator trapping in general.
Yeah,
birds.
Since we're so limited on turkeys anyway.
Yeah, and the reality is we've done a whole bunch of these types of studies, and sometimes in contexts where it's much easier to accomplish an experimental design that's robust. So there was a meta-analysis that I thought really characterized this well, and it's something that I wanted to go into. I know you really wanted to go in detail, and I think it was really good for the audience to hear that detail about the turkey specific. But I thought it'd be better for us to, well, not better, also a good exercise in understanding this issue to zoom out to let's just look at birds, just in general. And this systematic review that also was a meta-analysis looked at 83 predator removal studies, where they're actually just like the turkey studies. In fact, I think the turkey studies might have even been in it. This review, they looked at 83 of those. That covered 128 species of birds. So some of them were like turkeys, they're ground nesters, gallinaceous birds, game birds. And a lot of them were non-game or threatened and endangered species all over the world. So lots of different kinds of systems and different kinds of predators being targeted in those systems. They also had 16 studies that were predator exclusion studies, where they basically kept all of the predators from getting in. So
a true predator-free environment.
Yeah, they're trying to create as predator-free of an environment as possible. And, like we've talked about with turkeys, everything won't eat a turkey. Well, a lot of these birds are in that shape where there's a bunch of different kinds of predators. And sometimes those predators are protected themselves.
Right.
So what do you think happened just in general? If we just aggregate all of the 130 some odd species that we were looking at the responses, when we aggregate all of them, what do you think happened?
I would guess minimal to, I would guess like a limited positive response to a neutral response, just because I think you're going to have some.
Because of the variation?
Yeah, just because I think you're going to have some where you got almost nothing and some where you got a little something, some where you got a lot.
Yeah. Well, if you look at just aggregating all of them together, and you look at hatching specifically and fledging success, the response is actually pretty comparable to what we saw in the turkey studies. So the actual raw numbers they reported in terms of that effect size, that's pretty similar to the overall.
A very
studies.
positive effect.
Yeah, pretty strong positive effect on nest success hatching. They call it hatching success and fledging success. Again, this included some ground nesting birds, some that nest in other places, the variety of systems. However, when you carry that on to the post-breeding population, there was a non-significant slight positive. So in other words, it was not statistically positive, but the mean was positive of the effect on the post-breeding population just as a whole.
Yeah.
So That's pretty interesting right there.
I think that's really interesting. And that's another, I think, important point, if you'll allow me to circle back
Yes.
to speak in Williams.
Please do. I just need you to bring the talent.
Well,
Could you bring the talent for me right
I don't
now?
know. If you're waiting on me to bring the talent, you might be waiting for a while. Pack a lunch.
Did I turn this microphone on?
But gosh, you threw me off now. But
That was my intent.
that was one thing that we never really mentioned in reference to those studies is, yeah, it sounds great that you have increased nest success or increased poult per hen ratios. That doesn't mean that you're going to have more damn gobblers in the trees next year.
Yeah.
When
we talked about some reasons that might be like dispersal, but they also have other reasons to die.
That's what we're interested in, right?
Yeah.
How does this translate into how many gobblers I'm going to hear?
I want turkeys to be stacked up on the same limb.
Yeah.
Because there's so many turkeys.
Breaking limbs like passenger pigeons.
Please give me some of that. That's what
fertilizing the bottoms with their guano.
You know what? I want it to be where we can have artificial perches in our food plots, and we'll just let the turkeys fertilize the plots. You know what I'm saying? Like that's what we're looking for.
I want to get to the point where we're more worried about turkey damage to soybean crops than deer.
Yeah, that is for me.
Or that you can't sleep at night because of all the gobbling.
Yes.
Does that resonate with you?
Yes. I want it to be like Bartram's. If I'm not going to lament about it, I'm going to appreciate it. I want to wake up at dawn every morning because of the herald of the morning won't let me sleep.
Bartram got so mad he was kicking hens off the nest.
He was, well, that was actually a different guy.
They all run together.
Yeah. That was Audubon that was crawling up on the nest. But, yeah, he was the one that was seeing crows and never talked about raccoons getting in the nest.
And that's what we were talking about earlier, where I was like, he documented all that crow predation because he thought he was being sneaky, like crawling up in the prone on these nests. But the reality was he was leading the hen to abandon the nest.
Yeah, and the crows started following him, knowing he was about to. He probably had a pet crow or something.
I mean, they're smart bastards.
I know they are. There's all kinds of cool stuff.
I just keep gobbling this afternoon. I'm on a roll.
Yeah. Man, you're getting me fired up. So, I don't recall where we were at. But I know that I need to hear a string of gobbles for 100 miles in every directions or whatever Bartram used to say.
Yeah. So where we were was, did you really lose your place or?
No, I'm good. Okay. I was just kidding. But I mean, if you want to tell me where I was,
I can tell you where you were.
Where was I?
You were talking about how there was a positive trend, but it wasn't statistically significant into translating into the breeding population.
Yeah. So they had this relatively large, significant positive effect. And when I say significant, I mean statistically significant. Mm-hmm. Positive effect on hatching and fledging when you lump all the studies in together, the 175 unique case studies and all that stuff that we talked about, and the 16 predator exclusion on top of that. So almost 200 unique studies. When you lump all those together, you have this significant positive effect on hatching and fledging success, which sounds excellent, right?
Sign me up.
But when you carry that over to the post-breeding fledging success, wait a minute. Yeah, the post-breeding population, now that significance has diminished to where it's not statistically significant, and there is a positive mean, but it's not different from random noise.
Not different from zero.
Right.
Like you can't prove a positive or a negative effect.
Right. You just have there's a trend, but
there's too much noise.
Yeah, there's too much noise to detect an effect. And that carried over to the breeding populations. Although they were able to detect a significant relationship statistically with the breeding populations, and sometimes that overlaps and sometimes it doesn't, depending on what species it is. But they were able to document an effect significant effect statistically, but it was still far diminished from that effect on hatching and fledging, which is pretty strong when you look at that many species that they were able to pick up a pattern, because it was widely variable across studies, as you might imagine. And but it was still, like you said, in terms of the how many, if we were just going to talk about turkeys, how many more gobblers it was, it would be a really small gain.
Yeah.
And that to me suggests pretty broadly that there are some compensatory things going on that are affecting the populations, that just because you remove predators, that doesn't necessarily result in more birds in the spring. And again, this is on a whole bunch of different bird species, but that, I think that pretty strongly suggests that. When you start digging in, so overall, the predator removal seemed to be positive, at least in early stages of life, and it still maintained it into the breeding for not nearly the effect size, about basically a third of the effect size. But yeah, it when you start to drill in on that, there are a couple of things that were really obvious. One, that effect that you saw in hatching and fledging, when it was a predator exclusion study, when you look at just that subset of studies where they were basically keeping all the predators out, that the effect size actually doubles then. So that's kind of speaking to one of the things that we talked about with turkeys. In the exclusion, they're keeping out a much wider range and then more effective even within species of predator. So they essentially created a predator-free area, and they get about double the effect size on average from that. On hatching success, that data does not carry over to the population. That wasn't in here.
Yeah.
So we don't know if that equates to more birds in the population come next spring or whatever. But the hatching success. Let's see. The other thing that was really striking when we start digging in is when you look at aggregating all those studies and what's actually driving the positive effect, it was a combination of the predator exclusion studies, and there were a whole bunch of studies on islands. Okay. Like actual islands in the ocean.
Like shorebird colonies, probably.
Yeah. Different, they're wide variety, but a lot of them are shorebirds or some sort of seabird. Yeah. That are nesting on islands. And a lot of those are imperiled species, that they're on the brink of extinction or they're not doing so well or whatever. Right. And also on those islands, it was very commonly a predator that was a non-native introduced species, like cats or black rats in particular.
So what I'm taking from that is areas that have more control over predators achieve better predator control.
Yes, I would say that's pretty accurate. So you're on an island, and you're secluded. You're stopping that immigration problem that we talked about. It's one, the compensatory immigration is no longer an issue if predators can't get to the island because of ocean.
Yeah, and especially if you're talking about an invasive species or an exotic species that's been introduced there, maybe there's not as many source populations around for it to be recolonized.
Right. Yeah, and that's probably the case with a lot of these studies. So that's when it really works well. So we can learn some things from that. One, the predator exclusion is sort of like making it an island. Yeah. I don't even know what that would look like for turkeys. Like some kind of, you said earlier, an aviary. Yeah. Like a gigantic aviary or something.
Well, yeah.
Hey, the hardest thing would be somebody out there that can accomplish that.
The hardest thing would be keeping the hawks, owls, and crows out.
Yeah, because a lot of our predators that we can't address legally are avian. Yeah. So the mammals are probably a little easier to deal with, where you can just use fencing. But so that's one thing, that the predator exposures in these studies are effectively creating an island because you're stopping the immigration problem. So it makes sense that those would be in alignment with each other.
Yeah.
It's also on the islands. It's usually depauperate in the predator community relative to the mainland. So it's pretty common that you just have one predator that you can target.
I wonder if any of these studies that used disclosures, and maybe I need to dig into it deeper and read more for myself. And you probably have to go back and look at the original papers to determine it. But,
yeah,
I'm even thinking about envisioning with the disclosure these situations where they're identifying individual nests or groups of nests and just putting fencing directly around them. Let's say you've got like coyotes preying on like tern colonies or something like that.
Well, in some of these
easy to
populations, they're so restricted and there's so few individuals.
Yeah.
That I think that's probably true.
Yeah.
I mean, we know there are some species that, I mean, I was thinking about sea turtles, but
we fence off sea turtle nests too.
There's definitely places where we could apply that kind of strategy and at a small scale like that.
Like they'll put the mesh over the sea turtle eggs so that they can't dig down and like coons and stuff can't dig them up.
Yeah, and there's actually been some really good raccoon studies where they trapped and they didn't see any response in sea turtles. One of my good friends and colleagues did one of the best studies on that I've seen. So all that to say, basically, when the studies that did not perform very well, they were basically bringing down the average, and a lot of them had really modest effects that were positive or no effect, and sometimes negative.
Let me guess where they were.
Yes, please do.
Somewhere like places we typically manage turkeys.
Pretty much, yes, in the mainland.
Yeah.
So that's where it was tended to be less effective. It makes a lot of sense because you're dealing with all these confounding problems that we've already discussed. So that's kind of what they said, but that also brings in another aspect of this that I've heard people bring up. Your property might be an island effectively if you're surrounded by agriculture or you're surrounded by a landscape that's not very conducive to a lot of these predators.
Maybe you've got a river on one side and a major highway on the other or something like that.
You might have a better a better chance to control populations when you don't have that compensatory immigration confounding it. And I think these studies show that the effect size can be quite a bit larger, but I will also point out that those studies didn't have the number of birds that are carried into breeding or post-breeding. So let's see, there were a couple other things. The authors thought that they had a couple of interesting things that they wanted to get across to the reader. One, many of these studies are fraught with the same problems that we talked about with the turkey study. They had poor replication. They didn't report metrics that were important. They didn't have a very high sample size. All these different things that we were talking about.
I've never, for the record, run into any of those issues.
Well, some of them didn't report their what their predator trapping effort looked like.
Yeah.
How many predators they took out, all that stuff, when it happened. So there are lots of problems, and a lot of these studies were done in a time where that wasn't as common to report in your paper or whatever. But so there was a huge amount of variation across studies. Again, I think I already said it, but there's sometimes it even was negative. That was actually relatively common. So you actually get less of your targeted bird.
So maybe you remove one predator and that releases one that's more effective.
Yeah, stuff like that happens, or there's something else completely independent of it,
right?
That might be driving it. So they also made it a point to talk about, on the mainland population, the control efforts had to be maintained long term to keep the predators out because it's this immigration problem, and that's tough. because it requires a lot of time and money, and whether or not you're able to deal with that and want to, is playing a role in it, and it's definitely difficult, especially over large areas. And they only had a couple of studies that were actually with turkeys, which include the two that we were talking about.
Right.
The other thing that I think is an important point to kind of end on is they were suggesting predator trapping or predator control is a really effective strategy in some of these contexts, particularly for conservation of a species.
Mm-hmm.
But they stated that it probably, in many cases, will fall short of the game management goals that we use it for.
So the differences between those two objectives are probably conservation is more concerned with, is the animal present in the area that we want it to be, and is that population sustainable in the sense that it's going to maintain a viable breeding population, whereas with game birds, the goal is almost always we want as many of them as we can have.
Yeah, we're trying to maximize production and minimizing the risk of extinction, or just having a presence of the species is way different than maximizing the number you can carry.
Absolutely.
And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. But overall, at least at some age classes, they showed overall there was a positive effect of trapping.
Yeah. So I kind of feel like, as we get towards the end of, well, at least this first round of predator discussions, I'm sure we'll visit it again sometime.
Depends on how many emails you get.
Again in the future.
At Gulsby. I'm going to bring that up.
One day you're accidentally going to use the right one. I mean, it's like my email's published online. So.
I know. If people want to find you, they're going to.
But I kind of feel like where we're ending up with this is that it can work if it's done right, but it's not going to solve all your problems. It's not. It probably doesn't result in as much of a gain in the spring population as we would all like for it to.
Yeah. I would love if it just like that was the thing, because there are a lot of people that they're ready to do it. They're all in, buddy. If that's all they got to do, they're in.
I'll tell you, it's a lot easier than doing timber stand improvement work or burning.
Yeah. So I think, that's kind of where we're getting to. There is plenty of evidence to suggest that we can have a positive effect, but it is context dependent, and
you have to
may not
temper
apply.
your expectations.
Yeah, it may not apply in every situation,
Sure.
and your gain per cost and effort may not be as strong as you'd like it to be. But there's certainly some evidence across many of these systems that in some contexts we can have a real positive effect.
Mm-hmm.
That usually doesn't translate all the way to the breeding season, though, or after the breeding is out.
Yeah, absolutely. What's something else is this part of the discussion is kind of winding down. Something that I think that we should make sure to talk about soon, probably in the next episode, is whether or not there's other things that you can do besides lethal control that might increase the likelihood of success of nests, and then increase bird survival too.
Yeah, and ultimately carry over to gobbling.
Yeah,
I want gobblers.
Yeah, I mean, killing predators is definitely one tool that we want in the toolbox that we need to use on occasion, but there's other things that we can use to reduce predation too. And of course, what everybody thinks about is habitat, but maybe there's some practices that we even do that unintentionally increase predation rates.
Yeah.
If you get my hint.
Oh yeah. Well, we definitely need to address that issue head on, because I think that there are situations, there are a lot of people really worried about predators.
Right.
And duly so. They're always implicated in a large proportion of the turkey mortality.
Yep.
And then the obvious solution that just comes to mind for people is that we should get rid of predators.
Right.
Well, we need to temper expectations, which I think we've given a fair criticism of what we have available to do that. And a fair what's the word I'm looking for? A fair judgment of the literature.
Right.
That you can have some effects, and here are the things that you need to be worried about.
Right.
In terms of how it's going to affect your success. But we're so focused on that issue, and then there are other things that sometimes might be done that are shooting us in the foot.
Yeah, we're not being consistent in our behavior.
Right. And I think it's important for us to just talk about that straight on, since we're kind of dancing around it right now because we know it's coming. It's in the next one. Should we do this every episode? Then it's like the commercial that comes right before.
I think it's a great idea, but the problem is, and I don't know if I should even say this, but we don't always know what we're going to talk about in the next episode. So,
well, and we don't know when I'm going to fail to turn the microphone on either. Right. So it's hard to replicate it 3 times in a row.
That's right.
When you do.
All right. Well, you ready to get out of here?
Yeah, I think so. I think that was pretty fair. Thanks everybody for listening. In all seriousness, if you want access to any of these studies, we're trying to make this as transparent. We realize that we're intentionally trying to cover some controversial topics, and some of you are going to be upset about that.
Mm-hmm.
If you're upset about it, email Will. But the other thing I think is important is, we're trying to get this research out to as many people as possible. We really appreciate that you're listening to us.
Absolutely.
And all we ask is help us share it.
Yeah.
You've got friends or family that you're discussing these issues with, and whether you agree or disagree with what we're saying, we're trying to present the science on the matter as objectively as possible, and
we don't always
us share that.
We don't always know the answers to everything. There's so much to be left to be discovered, and
right. And we're pointing out we have weaknesses in our knowledge base, and you and I have weaknesses in our own individual knowledge base that other researchers are more knowledgeable on.
Absolutely.
We're planning to bring in other professionals who are really great scientists that have contributed a lot to turkey research.
I was going to say that as well. So, if you're getting tired of hearing our voices all the time, just be patient, because we got new blood coming on.
Yeah.
And perspectives and the experience and knowledge that comes along with that.
Yeah. And that's the idea with this. So help us share it. We really appreciate that. And let us know if you have questions or if you want to see studies or whatever. We're happy to share those. We're going to put links in the show notes to try to direct you to information, but we can share PDFs if you need or whatever. But we're doing our best.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And if people are still listening to us ramble on, they may have forgotten or fallen asleep, or maybe you have brought the talent. I don't know. Is that it?
Or they're just staying to watch you scratch those chigger bites.
I'll tell you what, man. I got covered up with them.
That's a rookie move.
Oh, rookie mistake. I'm going to tell you what. The mosquitoes this year will tote you away.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen the giant giant American mosquito?
No.
You need to Google that.
No.
That thing landed. I mean, my arm looked like a runway. There's an airplane landing on it. I heard it coming too.
It sounds like something you just made up.
No, I had to Google it. I was like, giant mosquito.
Yeah.
And it came right up.
Yeah.
Giant, I think it's called giant American mosquito. And apparently it's a bumper year.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I know are we really going to talk about mosquitoes on there?
No.
Okay. I won't go into my
that was
mosquito
all
story
I
then.
All right. Well, we can talk about it next time. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.